Hello, David. It's very nice to see you. It's a while since we saw each other, but we've known each other for a very long time and worked together, written together, spent many years working together in Leeds, and it's great to get the opportunity to speak with you.
Yeah, you too, even if it's only online.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah.
So we could talk about so many different things, but what I'd like to talk about in particular is the book that you're currently writing in my series. And I've got the great privilege of being the first person to read it, apart from you and Monica Foster, the other person who's writing it with you. And it's called Learner Relationships in Global Higher Education, Critical Pedagogy in a Multicultural World. Which is a long title, but it brings together those two elements. Can you start by explaining really the two different angles to that title, David?
Yeah. Well, the critical pedagogy angle is as it implies, that's focused on what are we going to do? How do we behave in the classroom, and what do we want to get out of it, really? So that's the pedagogy side of it. And the relationship side of it is, well, it's partly why are we doing that? What is it that we want to achieve through that? And it's partly what can relationship building among students, diverse students, what can that do to contribute towards the kind of outcomes that a critical pedagogy would be working towards? So the relationships I see as kind of both an enabler and an outcome, if you like. It's a method and as a process, but it's also what are we going to get from it that's important. So it's two of those things.
And yeah. the sense, the diversity angle is, as you've been talking about in most of your previous writing, it's diversity in all its forms. It's not simply about international, domestic, or whatever. You're talking about diverse students, and in this case, you're talking a lot about globally diverse students. Is the term that you use? Is that where you're going with it?
Yeah, and globally diverse students is the term that we've come upon, or we've created, really, because the complexity of diversity which we deal with in higher education, which should be a blessing but is often seen as something of a problem. That diversity, I think we underestimate. A lot of internationalisation literature underestimates the multicultural dimension in that, as well as other aspects of diversity, actually. So a lot of the time when we talk about international students, they are grouped together as one homogeneous group whose common denominator is that they're international, which is, of course, a huge thing in itself, or whose common denominator may even be just that they don't speak English as their first language, and on the other hand, we have all the fantastic work that's been done in multicultural education around diversity there, which tends to pretty much ignore the international dimension in there, and also the linguistic element is largely absent, not always, but largely. So I think the two things need to be brought together, but also it just makes sense to bring them together because so many of the answers that we might find in pedagogy are common, and so many of the outcomes that certainly many of us in internationalisation and many people in multicultural education want to achieve through education are very similar. They may not always be exactly contiguous, but they're very, very, very similar. And so joining forces, working together, learning from each other is something we should be doing so much more of. Yeah.
Well, you and I wrote about this in the first thing we wrote together in 2007. We said that the internationalisation agenda and the multicultural agenda are not two, but one and the same, effectively, or very close together. So I think we've been sharing those thoughts for a long time. But I've obviously followed your writing, read your writing over the years, and it seems to me that with this book, you're saying you're bringing a different dimension into the way the whole thing is being thought about, in that, you know, you've been talking about diversity for a long time, but here you've got that critical pedagogy angle, maybe, and pulling that together with the relationship theory is where you're getting something really special and unusual. Would you agree
Well,
with?
it's very kind of you to say so, and certainly in terms of my personal understanding, that is the case. You know, so I'm finding that my thinking has developed or is developing, partly in the process, through the process of writing the book and researching the book. That's happening. Whether or not that's a development in the world will be for other people to judge, but certainly for me, that's where that's absolutely true. I'm learning a great deal, and I think critical pedagogy has always been, even, you know, when I studied at university and I did an education degree, I was really struck by critical pedagogy. But when I, you know, got on my teaching practice in secondary schools, it seemed a million miles away from anything that I might want to achieve. And I think I put it aside, and then came back to it, but rather nervously, and not without the confidence, I think, to actually, I kind of mentioned it, thought it was interesting, but without the confidence to kind of say, actually, you know, this has got again so much to offer. It's a mature, developed way of thinking about what we do in education and why we do it. So why not really look at it seriously and see, can we harness that? Can we harness that to the internationalisation?
Yeah, for international education, because I think you said that the in terms of relationship theory, they don't necessarily think about internationalisation, and equally critical pedagogy doesn't necessarily think about internationalisation. So in a way, it's bringing the two together, and there's lots of Paulo Freire and Henri Giroux and all kinds of interesting stuff in there, as well as the more familiar authors that we'll know about in internationalisation. So I have to say I'm learning an enormous amount from reading it, and hopefully have time to follow up some of those references as well. But I just wanted to finally, in a way, talk about how you, for me as a reader of your work, you've moved on from you've always been very interested in diversity and the link between multicultural and international. You know, that's always come through, but somehow here it's built on, for me, certainly the previous book in my series, but the other one that you've done with Palgrave around diversity and inclusion in internationalisation, and the one around educational development. It seems to me that you've built on your thinking and you're moving forward very significantly in this particular work.
Well, thank you, if I am. Yes, but the Palgrave volume, I think, again, I was very pleased with that volume when I'd written it, but I was very nervous when I was writing it, because I think, you know, multicultural education is so firmly, it has such a strong tradition, such passionate people, such great work that's come out of there, and I didn't want to feel that I was, or to appear that I was sort of somehow, you know, grabbing that and sort of say, hey, here we are. So it is important, and it is right. So writing that book, in a sense, helped liberate my not just my thinking, but my feelings about whether I really had any authority to go into that area, you know.
Right.
Partly white, male, middle class, English language speaking, British born, you know, all those layers of privilege, which sort of, in a sense, don't give me full access to understanding that literature. And then in the academic development book, where I was writing about started writing about critical pedagogy in that book, and again developed my confidence. So those two things certainly helped. But it was the relationship, it's the move towards relationships, which I think has been most significant in this. Developing relationships between globally diverse students, between intercultural relationship development. And the thing that liberated my thinking on that, I think, was literally coming across really, a theory called relational cultural theory, which you don't need to worry too much about the detail of that theory, but its basis really is that actually human beings yearn relationships. We only grow when we have relationships. And when you contrast that kind of optimism, that kind of will to develop good relationships with some of the work which talks more about how difficult particularly how difficult intercultural relationships are, then it provides a way forward. I'm not denying the difficulty of relationships, but all of that work that I'd seen before kind of came to a dead end almost. It was all about the difficulties, and so it became in a lot of the literature where the focus is on intercultural capabilities, if you like, cross-cultural capabilities, our own writings in that area, intercultural dialogue, intercultural competencies. Again, that's all good stuff, and I believe still in all of that. But then I'm thinking, but where does that come from? And it has to come from the student's will, the attitude. Deirdre talks about attitude, how important that is, students' attitude. Well, why am I going to want to talk to anybody unless I feel that there's a relationship that I can build? Not an intimate relationship, not a long-term friendship, but a relationship with that person, which enables and drives those competencies, that competence development, those difficult conversations, and all of that kind of thing. Yeah. So
I think it's really enlightening the way you've put it in this book. But I think we shouldn't people shouldn't assume that this is a very theoretical book. I mean, it's got lots of interesting theory in it, but it's also incredibly practical, I think. And it's got things in it which I think people will see, when we talk about internationalizing the curriculum, internationalization at home, this kind of thing, people will gain from this really practical dimensions. It may come from a theoretical perspective, but it's very, very clear how these things can be applied in the classroom. And I, having had the pleasure of seeing you working in a classroom, David, I know how incredibly good you are at working with students as well. So I don't want people to have the impression you're a pure theoretician. But just going back to, and this is finally your final question, really. I wanted to talk about your earlier life back in, because you lived in Japan, you've lived all over the world, you've traveled a lot as well, and all of this has fed into your thinking, and now you kind of almost, the theory is coming in behind all of that as well. And is that, do you feel that those early experiences took you in this direction?
Without a shadow of a doubt. Actually, I would say going back earlier than those early experiences, actually, because I think I remember when I was probably 12 or 13 being just outraged at the what was going on in the States in that time, in the civil rights movement, at the treatment of people, the way the police were reacting to the demonstrations, the whole thing, and it was just enlightening to me. And then sort of in my teens and so forth, being very wedded to a particular political tradition in this country, which sees social justice as being the reason to be in politics, really. I'm not a politician, but allied to that. So that is always in my background. But then going and to a very small extent experiencing what it is to be an outsider in other people's society, and how generous people were, and how in terms of, you know, my intercultural competencies were far from great, shall we say, at those times. How generous they were, and finding, you know, how ways to communicate. Great, fantastic. So yeah, all of that has contributed to the ethos that sits back there,
Yeah.
and convinces me that good things can happen if people want them to.
Including when you don't speak other languages, David.
I know. Exactly.
I
Yes.
always give you a name when people say, oh, you can't have internationalization without languages, you can't have intercultural competence without speaking another language. But I think you show every time I meet you that these things are not, you know, that you don't have to have one and the same thing. But it's been great talking, and I do hope we'll see each other in person before too long. Thanks so much.
I'm sure we will. I'm sure we will. Yeah. Thank you, Elspeth. Thank you for the conversation, and all good luck to you.
Thanks, David.